Story 1. The Silent Passenger. It was a late, rainy night when Jacob, a taxi driver, picked up a passenger from the edge of town. The man was soaking wet, his face hidden beneath a hood, and he climbed into the back seat without a word. Jacob felt uneasy, but it wasn't unusual for late-night fares to be quiet, so he began the drive in silence. As the rain poured down, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man sat unnaturally still, not even blinking, and the longer Jacob drove, the heavier the air felt inside the cab. He tried to make conversation, asking the man where he was headed, but there was no response. All Jacob heard was a faint, rhythmic tapping, like nails drumming against the window. After what felt like hours, the man finally spoke in a low, almost guttural voice, giving Jacob an address that sent a chill through his spine. It was the cemetery on the outskirts of town. Jacob glanced in the rearview mirror, and for the first time, he truly saw the man's face, pale, gaunt, and hollow-eyed, as if he hadn't slept in years. He pulled up to the cemetery gates, but when he turned to tell the man they had arrived, the back seat was empty. The door hadn't opened, and there was no sign of the passenger. Shaken, Jacob looked down at the seat, finding a small, waterlogged note. Scribbled on it were the words, "Thank you for the ride. I've been waiting for a long time." That night, Jacob learned about the legend of the silent passenger, an apparition who hitches rides from the living, always headed for the same destination. The next morning, he found wet footprints leading away from his car, but they disappeared into thin air before reaching the cemetery gate. Story 2. The Crying Girl in the Attic. Maggie and her family moved into an old Victorian house that had been empty for years. From the moment they arrived, something felt wrong, but Maggie couldn't put her finger on it. The house had a coldness to it, a weight that pressed down on her chest every time she walked through the door. It wasn't long before strange things began to happen. Footsteps echoed through the hallways at night, even though everyone was in bed. Doors creaked open on their own, and objects would go missing, only to reappear in the attic, an attic no one ever went into. One evening, Maggie was home alone when she heard it for the first time, the faint sound of a girl crying. It was coming from the attic. Heart racing, Maggie climbed the narrow staircase and pushed open the door. The attic was dark and musty, filled with forgotten furniture and boxes, but there was no sign of the girl. Still, the crying continued, louder now, as if it was coming from right beside her. Terrified, Maggie ran back downstairs and told her family what she had heard, but they didn't believe her. Days passed, and the crying grew more persistent, echoing through the house at all hours. Finally, unable to take it anymore, Maggie returned to the attic, this time with a flashlight. As the beam of light swept across the dusty room, it landed on an old, weathered doll sitting on a shelf. Its eyes were cracked, and its dress was torn, but the sound of crying seemed to be coming from the doll itself. Suddenly, the doll's head jerked toward her, and the crying stopped. In its place, a whisper filled the air. "Help me." Maggie fled the house that night, but the doll remained, its hollow eyes watching from the attic. No one who has lived in the house since has ever stayed for long. Story 3. The Door That Shouldn't Exist. David was a contractor who specialized in renovating old buildings. His latest project was a 19th century manor that had fallen into disrepair. It was a beautiful, sprawling estate, but there was something strange about the place. As he worked, David kept noticing things that didn't make sense. Rooms that seemed larger than they should be, doors that led to nowhere, and windows that looked out onto blank walls. One afternoon, while tearing down a section of the wall in one of the bedrooms, David discovered something that hadn't been on the blueprints, a door. It was old and worn, the wood rotting away, but what caught David's attention was the lock. It was rusted shut, as if it hadn't been opened in decades. Curiosity got the better of him, and David pried the door open. Beyond it was a small, windowless room, no bigger than a closet, with a single chair in the center. The air inside was cold and damp, and the walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that David didn't recognize. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he stepped inside, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him, plunging the room into darkness. David fumbled for his flashlight, but when he turned it on, he wasn't alone. A figure stood in the corner, its face hidden in shadow. It was tall, its limbs unnaturally long, and it swayed as if it were waiting for something. Panicked, David ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The figure moved closer, its breath ragged and uneven, and David could feel its presence pressing down on him. Just as he was about to give up, the door flew open, and he stumbled out into the bedroom. Shaken, David left the manor that night and never returned. The door, he later learned, had been sealed shut for a reason. The previous owner had locked it to keep something inside, something that had been waiting for years to be set free. Story 4. The Midnight Librarian. In a small, quiet town, there was a library that was said to be haunted. People claimed to see a figure roaming the aisles late at night. A librarian who had worked there decades ago, before she mysteriously disappeared. Her name was Margaret, and she was obsessed with books, spending every waking hour in the library's dusty halls. One night, a college student named Emma stayed late at the library, working on a research paper. She had heard the stories but didn't believe in ghosts. As the clock struck midnight, Emma heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the empty library. She looked up from her desk, but saw no one. The footsteps grew louder, and then, without warning, all the lights went out. Emma fumbled for her phone, using its dim light to guide her. But as she shone the beam down the aisle, she saw a figure standing at the far end. It was an elderly woman, dressed in a long, old-fashioned skirt and a cardigan, her hair pulled back into a tight bun. She was holding a book, her eyes fixed on Emma. Slowly, the woman began to walk toward her, the book clutched tightly in her hands. Emma's heart raced as she backed away, but the woman kept coming, her eyes never leaving Emma's. When she was just a few feet away, the woman held out the book, her hand trembling. "I've been waiting for someone to finish it," she whispered. Emma grabbed the book and ran, never looking back. When she finally made it outside, she glanced at the cover. The book had no title, no author, just a single sentence written on the first page. "You're next." Story 5. The Shadow at the Window. Ellie lived in a quiet, rural farmhouse, surrounded by fields and forests. The house had been in her family for generations, and though it was old, it had always felt like home. But lately, something had changed. Ellie began to feel like she was being watched, especially at night. It started with a tapping at her window, just after midnight. At first, she thought it was the wind, but then the tapping grew louder, more insistent. One night, she looked outside and saw it. A shadowy figure standing just beyond the window, barely visible in the moonlight. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching her, its face obscured by the darkness. Terrified, Ellie closed the curtains and tried to sleep, but the tapping continued, night after night. One evening, Ellie decided to confront whatever was outside. She grabbed a flashlight and stormed outside, determined to catch whoever, or whatever, was tormenting her. But when she reached the spot where the figure had been standing, there was no one there, just the tall grass swaying in the breeze. Relieved, Ellie turned to go back inside, but as she did, she caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the window. The shadowy figure wasn't outside. It was standing inside the house, right behind her,